a very, very deep breath. Inhale, hold it at the top, and release with a sigh. Take a very, very deep breath. Secondly, I invite us, each one of us, to be mindful, to recall that we stand on the shoulders of our ancestors. That no matter who we are or where we came from, there is a genetic connection to an awareness that we are here, we are prepared, we are the perfect ones for such a time as this. Inhale, hold, hold, and release. I am the consciousness, the awareness, the creation, the power, and the presence of my ancestors. And I am grateful. Take a third breath. Inhale and release. Ashe. Amen. And let's get it on. Open your eyes and come back into the room. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Reverend Dereca Blackmon.
Thank you.
If we could now, Lynn Daniels, would you mind giving us our quick welcome?
Sure. My name is Lynn Daniels, and I want to extend a welcome on behalf of East Bay Church of Religious Science, located in beautiful Oakland, California. East Bay Church of Religious Science is dedicated to the spiritual transformation of the entire planet. And to that end, in July, we started our spiritual activism ministry, our sacred activism ministry. And the goal of the sacred activism ministry was to empower, to uplift, and to expand our programs and services that we offer at East Bay Church to Oakland, or throughout Oakland, the East Bay, the community, and the world. And that is what this program is a part of: voting as a spiritual practice, extending our services to talk about how important voting and civic engagement is. If you are interested in learning more about what we do at East Bay Church of Religious Science, please visit us at ebcrs.org. And now let's sit back and enjoy our conversation on voting as a spiritual practice.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lynn. All right. I know you all are here to hear from our phenomenal speakers, but before we get started, I'd like to just introduce them to you, however briefly. First is Reverend Dereca Blackmon, and she is a dear friend and member of the East Bay Church community. And I don't think bios do her justice, but I've got my notes, so I get it right. Reverend Dereca Blackmon is a passionate speaker, facilitator, and national expert on topics of diversity, equity, and spiritual healing. She facilitates uncommon conversations on issues of race, gender, class, and social justice, and is one of the country's leading speakers on spiritual activism. She serves as the CEO and co-founder of the Inclusion Design Group, which employs experiential training models that cut through diversity fatigue and allow participants to engage in deep, authentic, and meaningful dialogue. In addition, she speaks regularly at spiritual communities throughout the Bay Area. Our next guest is Dr. Jelani Cobb. Dr. Cobb is a powerful voice in conversations on race, social justice, American politics, and policing. He teaches at the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism and serves as the director of the Ira Lippman Center for Journalism and Civil and Human Rights. He is also a longtime staff writer at The New Yorker and contributor to various national networks such as MSNBC and CNN. In addition, he is a frequent contributor to documentaries that I'm sure you've heard of, including 13th by Ava DuVernay. Most recently, he was the reporter for Frontline's Policing the Police 2020, a dynamic and important look at the challenges facing police reform efforts in America in 2020. And he looks forward to participating in the New Yorker Festival this weekend, where he will be interviewing former Attorney General Eric Holder and Sherilyn Ifill of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Thank you both so much, and let's go ahead and get started. So, presidential elections are often prone to exaggeration and dramatic turn of phrases, but this year seems to be particularly hyperbolic in tone. Many people talk about democracy and the American experiment being at stake right now. Do you believe that this is an accurate assessment of the current election, and why? I'll direct that to Dr. Cobb.
Well, I was deferring to Reverend Blackmon. So if she has the option of answering or passing, and if she wants to pass, I'll jump right in.
All right, I'll jump in and say a few words, although as anybody knows, when you give a minister a microphone, beware. Yes, democracy is on the ballot, but it's not just on the ballot. It's the referendum that we're having as a country for the last 4 years and for much longer. You know, I think I've been saying maybe for about 10 years, maybe a little bit longer, that our democracy is in crisis. And, you know, I've heard Dr. Cobb talk a little bit about when do we actually have the notion of democracy and when does it start? So, hopefully I won't preempt his comments. But yes, of course it's on the ballot, but it's not on the ballot because we're voting between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. It's on the ballot because it's been eroding precipitously, especially in the last 4 years, but even before, when you look at the Bush administration and you look at Dick Cheney, we have been eroding democracy for quite some time. So yes, we are at a critical turning point, but it's not just the ballot, it's at stake in our whole nation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And to your point, you know, one thing that I always begin, when I'm talking to my students, I always begin with a grounding to make sure that we're clear. And I say that, you know, American democracy, to the extent that such a term is applicable, to the extent that such a thing exists, American democracy is younger than the American Constitution, which is to say, people make the casual assumption that the Constitution is the basis for American democracy. That was a document that was created at a time when Black people in this country were chattel, at a time when women could not vote, at a time when people did not even directly elect their senators. Their senators were chosen by their state legislatures. And you know, all of the mechanisms that we see that went into thwarting the will of the people. And so the true date of American democracy, you could say, starts with the 14th Amendment, which prescribes equal justice under the law. Or you could say that, and that is in 1868. Or you could say that it doesn't come into existence until 1920 with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Or you could say that it doesn't come into existence until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. However we want to define it, we can say we have a very feeble relationship to democracy in this country, even though it's considered the oldest constitutional democracy in the world. And so looking at the dynamics that we are seeing now, a president who has given every reason to believe that he will not recognize any election results other than ones that claim that he is victorious. The potential for violence, as we are speaking now, we've just gotten word that 6 men were part of a larger group in Michigan that was attempting to kidnap the governor of Michigan and put her on trial for treason. And this is a white supremacist militia, if the early reports are correct. And us seeing the rapid turning back of the democratic reforms that happened in the middle of the 20th century. And so, yes, I concur that democracy is very much threatened and it is very much on the ballot. And I also will agree that it doesn't simply end with us casting a ballot. It goes far beyond that to try to create the kind of society in which people are actually truly equal.
I have to jump in and say, as a native Detroiter, that there was no chance that they were going to grab Big Gretch and do anything to her without all of us rebelling. So yeah, so I'm really glad that that was thwarted, because that definitely would have precipitated a whole lot of drama that Michigan really doesn't want to have. So I'm so glad. But
like,
it is.
I'm sorry, was that like the official word from Detroit? Don't start none, won't be none?
Exactly. Don't start none, there won't be any. But yeah, I mean, I think I do want to build on this. We are part of one of the things that we have on the ballot, and I definitely want us to keep talking about some of the things that are important to us, for us to be thinking about why we need to vote. One of the things on the ballot is restoring rights to our returning citizens. Right? So when we talk about democracy, our folks who are returning citizens who have paid their quote unquote debt to society, many of whom never owed a debt to society, so there's that, but they've been stripped of their voting rights for, you know, a very long time. And so when we think about democracy, there's always been people who are outside of that. We've got things on the ballot initiative here in California, giving people an opportunity to vote at 17 in the primaries, if they're going to be 18 in the upcoming election, giving 16-year-olds the right to vote for their school board directors, right? Like, we are rethinking the idea of democracy, because we can see who's continually been shut out and how that impacts and tips the scales of who is represented in our government. And we all know that the other question about democracy is capitalism, and do we have a democratic government or do we have a capitalist government? Because we can see how much corporate industry buys the will of the politicians, as opposed to them feeling like they're servants of the people. So we could,
but
not to mention
go ahead. Just to build on that though, like, how deep does your crisis have to be that big pharma is behaving more ethically than people who are elected and empowered to do the will of the people, where the government is trying to push out a cobbled together vaccine to ignore all of the protocols about what's responsible and how you go about ensuring that a vaccine is safe for the public. And big pharma, the people who we could talk about for the rest of the day, going, no. Right. We're not going to, put this out. To date myself a little bit, I remember the old slogan for the wine commercial, which is, serve no wine before it's time. Right. And big pharma is saying this. This is where we are with big pharma. And to go to your point though about the things on the ballot, it's really heartening to hear about these ideas of enfranchising younger people. And I'll come back to that in a second. But one of the things I think that has always been curious to me is the fact that we believe that as a society, we have the right to strip someone of their ballot in the first place. I don't understand what is the mechanism, irrespective of what the person may have done. If we say that we are a democracy and the democracy is supposed to reflect the will of the people, unless we are okay with conceding that this person has become a non-person, then we don't ever have the right to remove the vote from this person, just like we don't ever have the right to end this person's life. But that's another conversation. But we get to this idea about enfranchisement. You know, the 13th Amendment comes about at the end of slavery because the Emancipation Proclamation had not entirely shut the door on the institution of slavery. And the 13th Amendment comes about as a means of ensuring that this regime would not rise again, with one glaring asterisk. If you ever see that film 13th, you know there's an asterisk right next to it because it's about the clause that said, it's, with the exception of people who've been duly convicted of a crime, which is the birth of that tortured relationship between Black people and the carceral state at that moment. But the 13th Amendment comes about as a result of that. You know, it is paid for in people's blood. The 19th Amendment comes about as a result of decades of struggle to enfranchise, to gain the right to franchise for women for a very utilitarian purpose. The people were saying that the laws of the society were stacked against women. And one of the big motivators for people wanting women to be enfranchised was the idea of domestic violence, that people needed to have laws that would say that it is not legal for a husband to beat his wife. And so people are trying to get the right to vote, and it has been paid for in their blood. And when we look at the constitutional amendment, I'm blanking on the number now, I used to have these memorized, but the enfranchisement of 18-year-olds, that comes about as a result of Vietnam, because there are people who are fighting in a war and not able to vote for the people, the government that has actually sent them off to die. And so at every turn, we kind of, I know people hear this and their eyes roll in the back of their head saying people died for these rights. And, you know, we tend to take that for granted until we are confronted by the possibility that other people may die to have to hold on to those rights. And those are very sobering realities, I think, things that we should take very seriously.
All right. Wow. Wow. Okay. So earlier you both brought up the governor of Michigan and that situation, which feels dystopian when you think about it. It does not feel, it does not match up to the tourist guide to the United States of America by any stretch. And so clearly that is just one example of some of the suppression and some of the animus that is present in this year's elections. But we've been hearing voter suppression tossed around, and it seems to mean different things to different people. How do you define it? And what are some of the examples that have you most concerned? And what's different this year about versus previous election years?
Mm-hmm.
I'll let Dr. Cobb start on this one. I know you
Oh,
talk
okay. So I'm working on a film about this, about voter suppression and the coming election. And the glaring thing is COVID, you know, the coronavirus. And so we started working on this film maybe 18 months ago. And we had what we thought was the storyline. You know, there are all of these mechanisms that people are using to disenfranchise people and have been, and they include some of them that you have heard about. Voter roll purges, which is, you know, people are registering lots of people to vote, and states are finding technicalities and reasons to remove people from the ballot rolls. There are voter ID laws, which are skewed in ways. North Carolina famously had one that would allow you to vote with a hunting ID, but not allow you to vote with a student ID. And so very clearly trying to curate the electorate in a particular way. And, you know, there's gerrymandering that happens to reduce the effectiveness of people's votes. And, you know, all of these different, and poll removals, that's the other thing, the outright removal of polling places, which is something that we've seen in lots of instances, and Georgia has been notorious about this. And so all that's just the playing field that we encountered in the middle of 2019 when we were starting this project. Then this virus hit, a pandemic started, and there was a push for people to vote by mail. And I don't even have to talk about how politicized voting by mail has become the way that the post office is being kicked around, and its effectiveness and efficiency is being diminished, being requested to do a heroic job of processing all these ballots and getting them all to the appointed places, but with fewer resources, fewer people, and so on. And so there's a whole lot of concern about this. And the other dynamic is that for a number of reasons, too many to go into now, absentee ballots from low-income communities and communities of color have tended to be rejected at higher rates. And so that's part of the game too, just to make sure that when people vote, that your vote actually gets counted. And so it's all of those dynamics. And what we have now is a kind of perfect storm situation, awaiting the results on November 3rd, which likely we will not know on November 3rd what the final tally is. But all of this is stuff that, keeps me up, and a lot of other people I know who follow these issues, keeps them up at night worrying about how it will all play out.
Yeah, I think I totally agree. We are at a precipice, right? When we talked about where are we, is democracy at stake? Well, part of the reason we say yes is because of the voter suppression, right? Because that's sort of the fundamental premise here, is that there's a vote for each person, and as broken as the Electoral College is, there's supposed to be a system of representation. And I think what's so alarming is that for many of us, we know the vote's been suppressed. It's always been suppressed in our community. There have always been attempts, some successful and some not as successful, to strip our voting rights away. But what I think has happened that has unraveled our democracy in the last 10 to 15 years is the blatant attempts, that it is forthright, that it is unapologetic, and that it is allowed, right? And tacitly and then explicitly supported by the people who tend to be proclaiming themselves to be our leaders. That what used to be the Republican Party feels now like the alt-right. And like I tell people all the time, remember the Tea Party? Oh, we forgot all about them. That's because they're the government, right? Mm-hmm. So the thing that used to be the fringe is now it's not the center, which I think is important for us to recognize. It's actually not the center. It is still the fringe, but it has acceded to power with what Dr. King always talked about, the silence of our friends. That's what's so frightening, is that aside from Big Pharma, which is our current sad example, how many people have stepped in and said, not on my watch? Mm-hmm. We will not allow democracy to fail in this way. We still want to respect that each person should have a vote. We don't want to win this way. We were waiting for someone to say, we don't want to win this way. We thought that there was at least that level of moral code. But I like to say, and people don't like for me to say it, we get the leaders we deserve. Mm-hmm. And this is our reality TV president. This is the birth child of Fox News and Jerry Springer. And we thought it was really, really funny for him to be going around talking about you're fired and you're fired. We loved that. It was entertaining until who he was firing was the government, mm-hmm. right? And now we are reaping that what we've sown, but also I think the recent film, The Social Dilemma, is really revealing, because part of it is disinformation, right? People don't trust any part of the government. I remember having this conversation 2 or 3 years ago and saying, name one institution that people trust in the US government? Name one. And I was talking to a friend of mine, and you know what they said? The post office. Mm. Which is, right? The irony of irony, right? So literally there goes the last one. The last domino has fallen. There is no institution, right? Not our Congress, not our Senate, not our presidency, not the FDA, the FAA, not FCC. There is no institution that we all trust, right? And so because of that, disinformation has reigned. Propaganda has reigned. We are in our silos watching whatever news. I mean, just the idea that if you just click on something that is disinformation, that is conspiracy theory, the algorithms of our social media and our search engines, right, which is where many of us still get our information, the algorithm will give you more of whatever you were looking for. So if you look for Pizzagate, because you're wondering, well, what the heck was this thing all about? It says, oh, you're interested in conspiracy theories? Let me give you some more. And so we wonder what has happened. And I think we cannot underestimate the disinformation that is provided by our technology and our dependence on technology and the ways in which it's splintered our understanding of reality. So Precious, when you talk about it being a dystopian moment, it's because this is now the fabric undergirding our entire society, and the way we think about information is shaped by forces that are so insidious but so embedded in the way we live day to day. I was watching that film, and I'll tell you that I literally set my phone like in the other room. I just felt so betrayed by the trust that I had had. You know, I used to brag about the fact that I didn't get my news from television, or as I like to refer to it in my sermons, the television, that I didn't get my news from television because it's not news. I remember when Fox News first came out, and my uncle used to always say, you have to watch to see what the other side is thinking. I was like, I don't read the National Enquirer because I don't need to know what they're thinking, right? Like, this is not news. This is commentary, and it's infecting the way that we think. But then, to be honest with you, the commentaries on the left were really kind of the same thing. So I just stopped watching it altogether. But my point is to say, what we're seeing in the erosion of democracy and in voter suppression is not so shocking because of the intention and the abuse of the powerful. What's shocking is the complicity of kind of the regular folks who used to say, okay, we're not going to allow it to go that far.
I think it's interesting. Of course, it's like the Parliament Funkadelic reference, like giving you more of what searching for,
Exactly.
what you're looking for.
Yeah.
You know, which is that flashlight. Somebody's gonna Google. Somebody would Google, like, get back to me on that. So now it's gonna be playing in my head for the rest of this conversation. But I think that, so in my kind of earlier life, when I was working primarily as a historian, you know, one of my subfields or areas of interest was the Cold War. And One Nation Under a Groove. There it is.
Thank you, Kevin. I was sitting here singing like, okay, done.
Right. And so we need a playlist actually for this conversation.
Yes.
Yeah,
Oh,
I
wow.
think if we could get Precious to get on that.
Yes.
But you know, in studying the Cold War, like, one of the things that, you know, I spent a semester in Moscow, and one of the things that you found with people there was like the after effects of the communist era, in which people didn't believe anything. They didn't believe the thing that happened in front of their eyes.
Yep.
And, you know, that's the ultimate objective of disinformation. It's not necessarily to make you believe the wrong things. It's to make you distrust your ability to know what's factual at all. And so you hear so many absurd things that you begin to just say, oh, I don't know what the actual fabric of reality is. And when you have people who are paralyzed in that way, they're easy to lead and mislead. And I think that's part of what we've been seeing, a lot of what we've been seeing here. And, you know, I remember it's just less than a decade ago that we were talking about social media as this liberatory force. When we saw the protests in Iran and the Arab Spring and all these other things that were going on, we were like, okay, this is going to change the way that the world operates, that regular people, the common person, will be empowered in a way that they haven't been previously. But that's not the world that we're in now. And so I think that, like, connecting this to the idea, the theme of it, of, you know, voting as spiritual practice, is that I always look, you know, when my approach to history and what drew me to history was partly an academic interest and partly a, you know, kind of intellectual curiosity. But I also feel that it's a deeply spiritual practice. And it connects me to the struggles of people that came before me, you know, people whose names that we don't know, you know, people whose actions, you know, were quiet, unseen, but helped to undermine the structures that oppressed their people and prevented them from enjoying the fullness of their humanity. And so that's how I approach it. And I always look at this and think that what I take from my study of history, particularly the history of Black people in this country, has been the realization that the struggles behind us are bigger than the struggles in front of us. That it took a particular kind of spiritual audacity for someone, the greatest power ever assembled on the face of this earth, has willed and decreed that you will never, ever see freedom. And it took a particular kind of spiritual audacity for people to say, in the face of that, I will be free, or my children will be free, or my grandchildren will be free, but we will keep at this until there's one in my lineage that is no longer in the shackles that you've placed on us. And so I think that that's like where I see like the voting part of it, that it's not going into the booth and it's not, you know, the two imperfect, the imperfect choice and the abysmal choice that we have in front of us. But it's when, you know, my first experience with voting was in 1976. You know, my father was 50 years old when I was born. And so I was a late life baby. But it also meant that he grew up in the worst of Jim Crow Georgia. Like, he understood segregation when they were really taking segregation seriously. And in 1976, when I was 6 years old, my father took me into the poll with him to vote for Jimmy Carter, you know, his fellow Georgian. But he took me into that poll for a reason, to see him do something that he would have been killed for trying to do when he was a young man in Georgia. And I think that I connect to that part of it. Like, this is kind of each instance of us casting a ballot is reinforcing that idea, that audacity of that unnamed ancestor who said that we won't always be slaves.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's so, I love the spiritual audacity. I'm for sure going to use that. I've quoted you a couple times, but you're going to definitely get this one. Susan Taylor is one of my mentors. She loves to say, this is not the rough side of the mountain. And I think that's so important for us to remember, because it's easy to feel really down, to feel totally overwhelmed by everything that's coming at us right now. But it's not so different than what was always coming at us, and look at the triumph that we've had over those things, right? It doesn't mean that we're there, right? It doesn't mean that we should feel like, I think there's a question in the chat now about rage, right? We're right. We're right to be angry.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I always say, if you're not angry, you're not paying attention. But what is it for people of faith to do, right? And I think one is, you know, part of our spiritual philosophy in this community is God is all there is, right? We don't talk about a force that opposes that spirituality. We don't talk about a force that opposes that power. We talk about the totality of that power and its dominion over all things, its presence in all things. And one of the things that I've always believed is that faith is not for the good times. That's what gratitude is for. Faith is for times like these. This is the moment where you get to prove what you believe in, right? This is that moment where you get to decide if you really believe that love is stronger than hate. Now, it doesn't mean that you just have to ignore oppression or discrimination or prejudice when it's happening. It means that when I shifted my work, so I was one of the lead architects with so many other powerful organizers here in the Bay Area when Oscar Grant was murdered in 2009. So we organized something called the Coalition Against Police Executions, and called the first rally that happened at the Fruitvale BART station in January of 2009. And then the second one where 10,000 people showed up to City Hall. And that rally was called Working for Justice, Praying for Peace. Now, I had to fight to get that praying for peace in there. We met at our church and Olivet in West Oakland, and we met in churches, and I wanted for us to have that presence of prayer, that spirituality that I knew got us through so many things. And it was a fight on both sides, right? So in ministerial school, and D. Jacqueline and I went to ministerial school together, we had a instructor who said to us, well, politics has no place in the church. And I looked at her and I said, well, she was white, and I said, if politics had no place in the church, we wouldn't even be sitting in the same room together. right? Because that's the legacy of what bringing politics into the church is about. And it's a historical legacy. Gandhi said, if you think politics doesn't have anything to do with religion, then you don't know what religion is. Because this is about justice. It's about the love of people. And this is the moment where, you know, I became a minister because of the Oscar Grant movement, because I had a moment where, you know, people threw red paint on Dorothy Duggars, who was the head of the BART board, and said, the blood is on your hands. And I have always been unapologetically Black, but that was the moment when I realized that I wanted to be unapologetically spiritual, that I wanted people to know that if you called me, you were going to get some fire, but you were also going to get some prayer. Right? That it was going to be an integration of both of those things. And I believe in this sacred spiritual activism and that it's about what we're for. A friend of mine likes to say, Dr. King had a dream, not a complaint. He wasn't just trying to get off the back of the bus, right? He was talking about white children and Black children holding hands. And what that meant was not just that Black children had to do something, it meant that white children were going to have to reach their hand out. And that was radical imagination. Right? That was radical at that time. I talk about, you know, you were talking about slavery, Dr. Cobb, and I talk about what is it to be Harriet Tubman and to imagine a freedom that you've never been to and convince people to go with you someplace that you've never been through the night with dogs chasing them. Like, what kind of visionary is that? And that, to me, for me, my moment in Oscar Grant was that I knew what I was there for. I was there for the love of Black boys and Black men and Black people and all people in my community, for the sacredness of their lives. It was, you know, Wanda Johnson, his mother, that I connected with. And I, as a mother, was just like, no, this cannot be. And so it was never, I believe in the fight. I believe in the anger. Thich Nhat Hanh says, anger is our baby. We have to take care of it. Right? We have to find out what it's telling us, what's wrong with the baby, right? So I believe in the power and the presence and the need for anger and for rage, right? Righteous rage is important because it is the fire, right? It is the spark that gets our attention. I have so many stories about this, but I'm gonna pause because I know we have so many other questions and topics, and I'm sure I'm gonna get back to D. Jacqueline. I was about to go into the fire triangle, but we're gonna wait and see what else the questions are, and we'll get back to that.
Can I touch on that for a second while we're waiting for this other question to come through? Like, I think that it's important if I can add like the historical vantage point on that, because
yes, please.
You know, in Frederick Douglass, in the narrative of his life, he talks about Covey, you know, the man who attempted to beat him, to whip him. And, you know, this is the point that Douglass fights back, you know, decides that he's not going to go for it. And he says they tussle and fight and roll in the dirt. And, you know, Covey, realizing that he's been beaten, just kind of, you know, brushes himself off and says, if you do something like that again, you'll get more of the same. But really it was him trying to cover his pride because he knew he had been beaten. And Frederick Douglass points to that as the moment at which he stopped being a slave. Not the moment he escaped.
Yes.
He was like, I'm a free person that happens to be in shackles right now. But that's the point at which he ceased to be a slave. And so he had to draw on that anger. He had to draw on that reservoir. And then when I talk to my students about this, I'm like, you look at the people who we praise, we don't ever focus on the fact that they have a counterpoint. That Ida B. Wells is great because she knew that those white people would burn down her printing press and try to kill her.
That's right.
And she published these stories about the lynchings anyway.
Yes.
That Frederick Douglass knew what Covey was going to attempt to do. He fought back against him anyway. That Dr. King wasn't great despite Bull Connor. He was great because he knew exactly what Bull Connor was capable of. Or Harriet Tubman and the entire institution that she's fighting against. You know, we just kind of go through these things. Angela Davis in the state of California, Ronald Reagan. You know, these are people who we praise because of the counterpoint. And so I think that when we look at what's the forces that are arrayed against us, it really becomes this question of whether we believe the things that we say about our heroes.
Mhm.
And that's like a question that I had to actually grapple with on election night 2016, where I saw the country sliding closer to fascism. And I was like, what do we do? I was like alarmed. I was up all night and I was trying to figure this out. And then it was like, what do you believe?
Mhm.
Do you believe the things that you've been teaching?
Mhm.
Because if you believe the things that you've been teaching, then that tells you what your next steps have to be.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, oh, we could just talk about this. What I love is what you said about the consciousness, right? Because that's what we teach. And when we talk about spirituality, it's a consciousness. So Frederick Douglass is talking about his consciousness. And this is what's so key in terms of thinking about how we engage voters, is we're talking about a shift in consciousness, right? In terms of my ability to believe in my efficacy, that I can make a difference, and not just through voting. Because I think that's the problem, is that we try to sell voting by itself, right? The consciousness is what we're trying to shift. Harriet Tubman said, I freed 1,000 slaves, but I could have freed 1,000 more if only they knew they were slaves. And so when I was doing youth work in West Oakland, I was working at McClymonds High School. And I think this was Kerry, when Kerry was running for president, and people came to me and they said, we need to register these young people in West Oakland to vote for Kerry. And I was like, absolutely not. I will not tell them to vote for Kerry, because it does not matter whether we have a Democrat or Republican in the office. Their school has still been crappy. Their job opportunities have still been bad. Do not ask me to have them vote for that. And they were just, the Democrats were so upset at me. Oh my goodness, it does make a difference, because look at what can happen in the world, in their lives. Let's talk about their lives, because it's the first time you come to McClymonds is to talk about vote for Kerry, then you've already missed the point, right? You're talking about people in your community that have been suffering for decades, for generations. And what are you going to do about that? So I was able, and Jelani and I, Jelani, you know that I worked with some of your good friends, Raz Baraka and Baye and all the other folks in Newark. We were able to register tens of thousands of people to vote, but not because they were voting for Gore or Kerry or any of those people. It's because they were voting for 3 strikes. They were voting for decriminalizing marijuana. They were voting for mental health resources. And that's the kind of thing that is on the ballot right now. We're talking about rolling back the ban on affirmative action. Like, we have a moment right now where we can reinstate affirmative action, and look at the destruction that 209 has done to our students, to our communities, to our businesses. We have an opportunity right now, if we're looking at what's going on in the ballot, to shift the resources for our schools again. We have an opportunity. There's so many things that are on the ballot right now that are huge, significant initiatives. That's what we should be talking to people about, because especially in California, there's sort of this foregone conclusion, well, our votes for president, they always go the same way. And that's kind of the same thing in terms of the Black community feeling taken for granted, right? That there is this way in which, well, everybody just expects us to vote Democrat. Forget about the presidency. Don't get mad at me for saying that. But actually, what's going to motivate people to get up and go out to the ballot, to stand in the lines when there are no polls, to make sure their ballot gets in early, is it has to be the things that impact their day-to-day lives. And as much as this current administration is negatively impacting our day-to-day lives, it's not as salient and as direct as some of the things that are down ballot. And so I just think that that's super important. There's more to this question, but I'm going to let Precious, you get back in, because as you can see, the two of us would just talk. I'm right. Oh, we have a moderator. Precious, you want to say something?
I mean, I have to admit, y'all can just keep going. Literally, the next question I wanted to ask, you already addressed, and then Jelani came in and the next question. So, okay. I mean, I guess I'm still processing too.
It's all good. We go. I do want to.
But can I talk while you're processing it? Can I just one other thing about your? Oh, did you want to ask your question?
No. Go ahead.
Okay. So I think that the thing that's important too is the things that happen in between voting. Because I was in California when that travel ban came down.
Oh, right.
People didn't need their marching orders. They didn't need a coordinator. They didn't need, like, oh, no. We're going to the airport. That's where we're going. I called my friends in New York. It was like, we're going to JFK. This is not going to stand. And I think that those things are important. They're crucial because these are things that seem like they're happening from afar, but their impact is felt in your community. And so, one other historical example is that, there's a case in Massachusetts, the case of Anthony Burns, who was a Black man who had escaped from slavery. And after 1850, when the fugitive slave law was passed, and the government created basically a federal bureaucracy charged with dragging free people back into slavery, or people who had escaped from slavery, dragging them back into bondage. This greatly exacerbated the tensions that led to the Civil War. And it wasn't simply because of the abstract idea of slavery, which people may have opposed, they may have supported, and then there were a whole large number of people who didn't think about it because it didn't affect them directly. But one thing that people had in that time period was a super intensely developed sense of local allegiances. At a point where life is difficult, you depend on your neighbors depend on you. If you are part of a community, it has a real salient meaning in a way that we don't always recognize now. When the Marshals attempted to bring Anthony Burns out of Boston, thousands and thousands of people, most of them white, poured into the street because the issue of slavery was no longer abstract. They were saying that this person is one of us. And so those connections between what we do locally and what we see locally and what happens nationally, we had to be very clear and very explicit about those. And the last thing I'll say about it is this. When I was in South Carolina, after the deaths of the 9 people in Emmanuel, the massacre of 9 Black church members, Nikki Haley announced that they were going to remove the Confederate flag, which I immediately dismissed. And I happened to be walking with the Mark Morial, who was the president of the National Urban League. And I said to him, and Mark is a really smart person, I respect him. And he said, I said to him, I was like, I can't believe they just took that flag down, like they were offering that as empty symbolism about what these people's lives were. And Mark said something that really has stayed with me since then. And he said, yeah, but you keep the symbolic victories because they're part of what fuels you to keep going until you get to the substantial ones. And so it's all those things that you get the people out to the airport, to say, no, that this won't happen, that you get the people out to the courthouse to say, no, you won't take Anthony Burns back, even if they wind up saying that this is in the hands of the Supreme Court. But the fact that people see each other and they know that they're not alone, they know that people, that they're not the crazy one, the people who recognize the importance of these issues, that keeps people going to the point where you can say, we're going to actually remove these people from power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's super important. The work that I do right now is diversity, equity, and inclusion work in corporations. And I was working with a multi-billion-dollar corporation when right after George Floyd was killed. There was, as you can imagine, I was one of the most popular people on the planet. And I had CEOs calling me at 8 p.m. at night asking if I could talk to their whole company at 8 a.m. the next morning. And it was hard for me at first because I'm used to being in the trenches, right? Like I'm an organizer, I'm an activist. These are the things that I love to do. But I realized that the opportunity to sit with a corporation that has, billions of dollars was also something that I needed to take advantage of. But I went in and I talked to those folks, and the next thing that they did was they gave all of their employees Juneteenth off permanently. And I was just like, I have failed completely. If that's what you what I have said, because the company was like 98% white. And I was like, what are all these white folks going to do with Juneteenth off? Right? They didn't even have the King holiday off before I got there, but now they have the number of companies that have Juneteenth off right now is just mind-boggling to me. Right? Or, or schools or I mean, it's just, y'all remember when it was just like a
I
little
know, it was
that
just
we
us.
had, and it was for real, just us. But, and people didn't even know what that was. But I do hear what Mark Morial was saying, is that the symbolism is important. I think where I get concerned is that we used to respond more to the, one protester standing alone against an armed police force. But the moment we had the 70-year-old white man on the ground with his head bleeding and the police were just walking past him, I was like, uh-oh. See, I look for the cultural signs. I always say the moment that I knew that this regime that is the United States was coming to an end is when they threw the shoe at Bush, or the shoes at
Yeah.
Bush. I was like, oh, right. And then Chavez said, I know he was here. I can still smell the sulfur.
The sulfur, yeah.
I was like, oh, okay, this is not what we are, not what we used to be. And I do feel a concern about that in our society, that there used to be this sort of moral high ground that you could accede to, that you wouldn't have people, if there was a shooting in an elementary school, people would not say that was a conspiracy. Right? Like you could count on the idea that people as a whole country, right, would be mortified by a shooting in an elementary school. And when we got to the point where people would say even that didn't happen and actually go after the parents and tell them that they were lying, I could see the fabric fraying. But I don't want to just focus on the negative. We're actually here to talk about spiritual community and voting as a spiritual practice. And so I want to actually come back to this question about spiritual folks and rage. So when I was involved in the Oscar Grant movement, I said I became a minister because of it, but I also learned to really become more comfortable with anger. I remember that when we had the first protest, we had what we called the peaceful protest, and then people broke off and they, burned cars and all of the things. And one of my national mentors said that I needed to make a statement denouncing the property destruction, which is really important distinction from violence. Please don't use the same word to describe both of those things. So I needed to make a statement denouncing the property destruction. So I did. And so we made this big statement as an organization. We denounced, we had, peaceful protests, blah, blah, blah. And a few days later, an older anarchist came to me and he said, let me tell you something, young lady. If we hadn't burnt cars, you wouldn't have been on CNN. And I just paused, and it hurt so much in my heart because I knew it was true, right? Because the way the news media works is if it bleeds, it leads, right? And so I began to sort of reconceptualize this thing. And when I got to ministerial school, one of our teachers there, Reverend Deborah Johnson over Inner Light Ministries in Santa Cruz, gave me a frame that helped me understand it. And she got it from firefighters, and it's called the fire triangle. And it is the way you look at the elements of a fire. And I alluded to it a little bit earlier. A fire has 3 elements. It's heat, fuel, and oxygen. And she likened these to the way we think about organizing and activism. And you have to have the heat. And that's an important thing. It's important to catalyze the conversation. It's important to say, wake up, pay attention, like that baby that Thich Nhat Hanh was talking about. You also have to have the fuel. I was exhausted being in the leadership of that movement, feeling like I was being attacked from all sides. You have to have people who are going to come out and sustain the work, who are going to say, this is not a sprint, it's a marathon. So we're going to create institutions, we're going to create community instead of trying to do these things as individuals. We're going to create connections between our struggle and other struggles. That's the fuel that sustains the work. But you also have to have oxygen. And that's where spiritual folks come in. And I love what you said, Dr. Cobb, about somebody saying, this person is one of us. That is what spiritual people can do. You need to say, the people out here throwing rocks, breaking glass, they're one of us, because what they're doing, we're on the same side. We are both in the quest for justice. And it's hard some days. I can tell you that I remember when somebody was trying to throw a rock at one of the churches I supported, and the security had to come out, and that's because there were people who weren't from our neighborhood. It's not an easy conversation to have, but it is an important conversation to say your role, especially as an ally, is not to come to the movement and criticize people who have been oppressed, people who have been murdered, people who have been discriminated against. It's not to come and say what they shouldn't be doing. Your role is to say what works. And if you're not actively working on something that works better than what they're doing, then sit down, as Kendrick Lamar would say, right? Like, it's time for us to actually think differently about what our role is. Our role as people of faith is to give that oxygen, to say, this is what we're working toward. Let's have that high watch mentality. For me, it's about working from a place of love. This is always for me about love. It is always for me about my absolute unwavering faith that good will triumph. It is, it does, it has to. And so how we transmute it into something positive was the question, is actually to contextualize it as part of the whole of what resistance and liberation looks like. So,
You know, I feel like that's like, I have like 5 questions I want to ask you about that, but we're like almost out of time. It's like the moment time has like zipped by.
We have time, don't we? What are we doing? Precious, how are we doing on time?
So right now we have about 5 minutes left in the conversation, and then the plan was to transition to Q&A, but I think we've all just been so wrapped in attention that people haven't been offering questions. So we might have some cushion.
Okay, well, let's do both. Go ahead, Dr. Cobb. I want to hear what you have to say. I'm just taking my
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that it's like, for me, kind of going back to this thing about like all these things that are, I was thinking about this in a kind of different way, like all the things that are like prerequisites for us to be able to create and sustain momentum, and for us to be able to create and sustain, you know, forward movement, and for us to remain inspired and not demoralized, and you know, the dynamics that kind of go into that. And so so that's what I was kind of like responding to in terms of what you were saying. And I also think that one of the other things I also try to point out to people is that, you know, in talking about voter suppression, you know, we're facing this thing, and if we were to talk about you know, where voter suppression came from, like the film Selma and what John Lewis was fighting against and so on, and you know, we had this idea that it was because they were racist, you know, which they were, but it was necessary but not sufficient. And you know, they had other reasons for trying to suppress Black people's votes. And you know, it kind of goes to the historian C.L.R. James, kind of radical leftist, and you know, his admiration, the Trinidadian, his admiration for the film Birth of a Nation, which seems weird. People are like, well, how can someone who's this radical Black liberation theorist, you know, and Pan-Africanist love the film Birth of a Nation? And he said that it was the only instance that he saw in American cinema where white people admitted that Black people were powerful and they were afraid of them.
Wow.
And so I think that same thing, like, you know, people were trying to suppress Black votes because Black people had power. And that the things that we're looking at now, people are going to all of these extremes, you know, because of these communities, the African-American community, the Latinx community, the Muslim community, people with disabilities, women, the transgender community, people, lesbian, gay, bisexual community, all these communities, all these people who have been targeted, insulted, marginalized, have had policy directed at them. And the point of it is to recognize that people don't do things like that if they don't know that you present a particular kind of threat. And so we have to proceed with that. That doesn't mean that everything is easy, that everything comes together easily, but we have to proceed with that kind of knowledge, like where we're coming to this from.
Absolutely. I feel like one of the things I love is Angela Davis talks about interlocking systems of oppression. And I think it's important, a lot of times I hear people will ask me the question about, okay, well, how do we focus on, say, Black Lives Matter, but not forget about, Brown Lives Matter, or not forget about environmental racism or healthcare or these things. And I was like, let's not pose it as an either or dynamic, because the same thing that's killing the people is killing the planet.
Yeah.
It's literally the same thing. It's the same force. And when we think about that, I think it's really important for us to recognize, if we're going to be spiritual community, really engaged in this struggle, and I think that's our intention, then what we have to say is that force has no power over our spiritual knowledge, our spiritual truth. We have to know that. And I love one of the comments that came in from one of my beloved friends, Sue Johnson, is Donald Trump is one of us. And I, honest to goodness, have prayed, have, said, I love you in my quiet times. When I became a minister, I sat outside my ministerial panel before they, give you the final interview. And I prayed for two people, R. Kelly and Dick Cheney, because there was no forgiveness in my heart for those two people at all. Like, I just couldn't find it. And so it's not that I found it, right? It's that God help my unbelief, right? Like, I just prayed through it, not because I'm like, oh, now all of a sudden I feel these like loving feelings about Donald Trump. It's that I'm praying for the strength to be able to remember who I am. And to remember that my strength, my power, my integrity, my morality is greater than this. What I really feel, honestly, is the last gasp of a dying way of life. This is what's happening, is a thing is dying and it is striking out and flailing to save itself. I like to say, I was talking to a group of international students earlier today, and they asked me about sexism and what is it going to take to eradicate sexism. And I told them something. I said, this is going to be very controversial. I was like, it's going to take a new idea of God. Right? Like, I am going to wager that in the future, people are going to look at this era as the era of a white, warmongering male God. This is what they're going to say. This is what was wrong with those people for these couple thousand years, is they believed that God was white, male, and warmongering. And because of that, they built a society based on those ideas. And when you really look at the history of Indigenous people, there were always this balance of masculine and feminine and two-spirit energies. There were all of these things that have been happening throughout history. And now we have this imbalance. Now we have this despotic God, this hateful God, this God of vengeance. And I think this is what actually drew me to this philosophy, is that I actually began to see that many of the great religions, beyond the dogma of personalities, right, and the personification of God, the deeper truths were about love. The deeper truths were about oneness. The deeper truths forced me to claim Donald Trump. And the reason why that's so important is because it reminds me how powerful I am. How powerful my faith is, right? That is what Frederick Douglass, I love that story, the Frederick Douglass story, because that's what he's talking about. That's what the last reference you made, like, this is birth of a nation, is actually, I've never thought of it that way. This is an acknowledgement that I'm powerful. The reason why you're trying so hard to suppress my vote, the reason why you're putting me in cages at the border, the reason is because you're terrified. And let's be honest, we wanted that. Y'all remember when Barack Obama became president and we were running around talking about by 2025, white people are going to be in the minority. People of color are going to be in the majority. We just kept talking about that, kept talking about it. And what were we trying to do? We were trying to make white people afraid. And guess what?
I don't think that though.
Oh, I don't know what you were trying to do.
Some people may have been saying it, but I think it's also kind of a reflection of saying that you have like no longer the majority numbers. Like, if somebody says that Black people are a minority, we don't automatically get afraid, I think, just because we're a minority. But I think the idea is that, like, if you no longer have the numerical majority in society, you don't get to have an outsized role in how things are. But I mean, I don't really care. I mean, I think that if somebody was trying to make white people afraid, it would just be turnabout as fair play, because at some point we look at it and go, like, in this society, white men are 31% of the population, and they hold 80, somebody, I think it's like 86% of the elected offices.
Right.
And if you look, like, their disproportion is they're so wildly disproportionate in these things that I don't know, like, people saying, like, we actually we are the majority in the world, and we'll soon
Right,
be
but when you
collectively.
threaten that power, it's terrifying. Let me tell you, I work in Silicon Valley and
Mhm.
corporations every day, and people who are being told you're going to have to give up your seat on the board, you're going to have to give up some of this money, some of the power that you have. It's terrifying. So yes, when people are saying you're not going to be in the majority anymore, it's code for, and you're not going to have the power. And for people, I'd like to tell the people who come to my workshops, if you have always had privilege and power, equality looks like injustice,
That's right. I agree
right? And
completely.
so when we said,
I
not
think
only
Precious
are we
Green is
going
trying to jump in here.
to be, right? Not only are we going to be, oh, Precious, I'm sorry.
No. This is actually a good segue to some of the questions that have come in, talking about acknowledging the power that we have that clearly is being seen and seen as a threat. Kathy asks, with the knowledge of our power, isn't that more reason to vote and use that medium as one of the means of asserting our power? And she actually posted in our chat as well, saying that, yes, the presidency is a contest between two white males and they may not have our best interests at heart, but do you not acknowledge that a vote for Trump will guarantee that the federal judiciary will be more conservative and assuredly limit any progress or opportunities for people of color, and indeed will create an environment that fosters our being considered second and third class citizens? It's a lot
I
there.
talked a lot. Dr. Cobb, I'm gonna let you go.
No, I mean, yes, that's my answer.
Right.
Like, I think that the judiciary is a very serious part of it. And even when we look at kind of what the Supreme Court has reconciled itself to, those are very crucial issues in terms of how we're going to, how we're going to live for the coming decade, the coming 2 decades. When we see, the Supreme Court that made the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, that was a culmination of particular decisions in the 19th century to create a Supreme Court that would make those kinds of rulings. The same with Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. And so the Supreme Court is very often a kind of bellwether for the general, or it's like a weather report for the general kind of climate that the country will be experiencing. So I think that's part of what we're dealing with right now, and why these things are so amazingly complicated and fraught, and why people are fighting so hard right now.
Yeah, let me be really, really clear if I wasn't before. Yes, I'm going to love him right out of office. So like, that was not my intention, is to say, this is part of what I'm trying to say, is because I'm reclaiming my faith, I'm not operating from a position of fear, right? Which is challenging to do, because I also am operating from a position of safety. And when you call the Proud Boys, I'm asking myself, am I safe in this country? Right? I actually am not going to be on the mainland during the election. I was trying to figure out what is the blackest place in the United States I could go to, and I decided it was the Virgin Islands. So that's where I'm going to be, right? Because I think it's important to actually balance, right? Having faith doesn't mean you don't have an earthquake preparedness kit. And so I think it is important for us to be real about some of the danger we're being asked to face and put ourselves into. Yes, it is going to make a tremendous difference who we vote for. And absolutely, we need to vote Trump out. But I don't want us to fool ourselves, right? The erosions that we have seen have been predicated on both parties ceding moral high ground. They've been predicated on a trend of giving away the democracy and letting it be for sale. That wasn't a one-sided thing. That was a both-sided thing. And so I don't want us, I think, let me just say this. There are many young people, many Black people that I am, hearing from, who are not going to vote for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, because we have reduced this to a simplicity of good and evil that people are rejecting. They are smarter than some folks have been in the past. They're not just apathetic, they're skeptical. They're like, we've been playing this game back and forth for so long that I don't really see that this side has been doing as much for us as it could. Now, I think that's short-sighted. We actually have to, I told one of my nephews, I was like, this is war and there's a gun in your face. You need to decide what you're going to do. Right. And that's probably not the most spiritual construct that I could have used, but like it was, he likes video games that are violent. And I just tried to speak the language of the person I was talking to. But yeah, yes, we have to vote him out, but we can't appeal to especially our young people to vote on the basis of this boogeyman thing. My brother became a Trump supporter because he didn't like the simplistic dichotomy.
Wow.
He said, and I was mortified. How can you even be related to me? But I started to listen to what he was being told. And what he was saying is, this side won't admit anything good that has happened under this administration. And I thought, is there anything?
The Trump administration?
Yes. So
okay,
my brother was saying that the left won't admit anything good that's happened under this administration. And I had to stretch my little brain because what I was looking at as the balance, right? Of course, there's nothing that's good in comparison to, the dismantling of the democracy, the caging of people at the border. It's complicated, and we have to complicate the narrative because oversimplifying it isn't working anymore.
But sometimes I think like and I'm not saying this about your brother, I don't know your brother. One thing that I find to
I don't know my brother either.
One thing I find to be a common theme among people who make unconventional decisions is that they like to think of themselves as smarter than other people. And so the best example of this, I think, is when the rapper, I forget which rapper it was, B.O.B., who was on the internet fighting with people saying that he just found out that the earth is flat.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And there'd been this big campaign to miseducate the people and, so on. He's going on and on about this. And so, then Neil deGrasse Tyson, who as an astrophysicist, like I know as one part of getting your degree, that you have to know the shape of the planets. And so he gets in and explains exactly how we know the earth is round. And B.O.B. said, the fact that you have Neil deGrasse Tyson on here arguing with me only proves my point. And so they're not attracted to a particular position, they're attracted to dissent. And the idea that people who are dissenting are inherently smarter than people who are agreeing. And so you make these dissenting positions that aren't defensible in any big sense. And you kind of recognize this going like, oh, okay, you're opposed to people saying that, this person is this. Well, what has he done that's good? And it would be roughly equivalent as saying that, Bull Connor got a bad reputation, or what else did he do? He was very efficient with handling the paperwork that came through Birmingham at the time. And so it's hard to kind of say, so what I try to do with that is that I don't push back against it. I just ask questions.
Mm-hmm.
What about this? What about that? Because when you push, that they're looking for the pushback. And so I just raise questions and leave it.
Okay, go ahead, Precious. But I just want to say, go ahead, but I do really want to say something about that. But go ahead first.
Kind of going back to, you touched on this a little bit when you were talking about how younger people in particular, they're not apathetic, they're just straight up skeptical. And, one of the biggest concerns is that is the demographic that is most impacted or will be most impacted by these various decisions. So I hear you talking about we need to essentially recognize the complexities, but what else can we do to, at the very least, shift their thinking to at least take the time to vote again?
A couple of things. I think the biggest thing is what we talked about earlier, which is talking to people about the issues down the ballot. Because I think if we actually get people out, the majority of folks didn't vote for him last time, and the majority of folks won't vote for him this time, right? So I think if we get people out, and how we're going to get people out is because of the down ballot issues. But I do want to say this. I think it's very important that we not oversimplify the complicated reasons why people vote the way they do. It's why we lost the last election, because we think we think we know what they are thinking. We think we know who they are, and they are not a monolith. And so I can tell you, we're talking a lot about Kamala Harris and her, the importance of her being a candidate of color. But I remember, when my friend Cynthia McKinney and Rosa Clemente were two women of color on the Green Party ballot. And I will tell you, if you have a conversation with Rosa Clemente about why she wouldn't vote for Joe Biden, she's going to give you some very complex answers about why that is. And it is not as simple as being, this is the one place where I disagree. It's not as simple as being, just kind of reactionary or negative. People have very complicated reasons why they don't want to vote for Kamala Harris. And they're just not willing to say, oh, I'm going to vote for the lesser of two evils. Now, I disagree with that. When I told my nephew, this is war and you better pick up your power and vote with it, I mean that. And I love this quote here. I want to say it out loud about Alicia Garza. Someone said that we're not voting for, and other people said a savior. We're voting for what the organizing field we are going to work within. Right. And so I love that concept that we're actually trying to just get, instead of having the rockiest soil, at least this soil is a little bit tilled, and we might be able to organize more effectively in that. But I think it's super important when we talk about engaging, right? Everybody's going, who's undecided? Who's undecided? The undecided people are not going to tell you they're undecided. But if you're listening, and if you create a platform for them where you actually respect their intellect and the ways in which they have actually thought about these issues, and then you engage them. And I think, Dr. Cobb, you're right, in questions, not in pushback. Listen, a conversation is two people listening to each other. If you don't want to listen, then you're not the right person to have a conversation, because anything else is a lecture. And nobody wants to hear you lecture, and you don't want to hear them lecture. So right now, we need to engage people on the issues that are most pertinent to who they are. We need to not assume that they're going to see the presidential election as the most pertinent issue to them. Two,
yeah, I think one quick thing is that I was distinguishing between somebody who votes for Trump and someone who has reluctance about voting for Biden. Like, I think those are two different two different actions. That's right. Yeah. Because I mean, I have like criticism of Kamala Harris. I have a lot of criticism of Joe Biden. I recognize that just on another basic level, you should be, even if you're fighting against the power structures, you want the structures to be guided by somebody who actually possesses their sanity. And I'm not certain. As a matter of fact, I will say this, I'm actively uncertain about the person who's presently in charge. There's a question that someone directed to me, and I'm trying to pull it back up now, about what history will teach us about what is about to happen in November and beyond, particularly with regard to alliances among Black and Brown people. So I don't know what history will teach us about what's going to happen in November. Like, we as like historians are very reluctant to make that kind of prediction, because we don't know how things look. We only look, well, the great vantage point, the great insight of history is that you have the vantage point of time to kind of see how things work together and things that you're not aware of at the moment. But I do think in terms of the issue of Black and Brown voters is that there are, lots of complications. I mean, there are complications when we say what's Black, what's Brown. Those are very totalizing concepts in communities with a lot of differences and distinctions. The Black electorate in South Carolina is not the same as the Black electorate in California, or New York for that matter. The Black electorate in Georgia is different than, even the Black electorate in North Carolina. And so you have different dynamics there. And then when we say Brown, we're very often lumping in, lots of different people with lots of different backgrounds and lots of different realities. I think that's become apparent as people have looked at the polling around what they're kind of amalgamating to be Latino support for Donald Trump. And if you're talking to Cubans in Miami, that is not the same thing as if you're talking to Guatemalans in New York. You know, very different kinds of experiences and issues. That all said, I do think there's some big, broad kinds of trends or realities. And it's a kind of thing that I think labor organizers have understood for a long time, that we can kind of grapple with people. So I'll just give you this kind of quick thing about a labor organization that I went to, spoke to in Los Angeles about 2 years ago. And I came out, it was a Black History Month event. You know, there's lots of Black people there. I won't say the name of the union, but lots of Black people there, but also lots of Latinos there, lots of South Asians who were there, lots of East Asians who were there, like lots of different people who were there for this Black History Month event. And they were like, yeah, because, you know, there are events that are very significant to our Latino members of this union. We expect the Black people to come out for that. We expect the South Asians to come out for that. And then when we have things that are, you know, particular to the South Asian community, we expect the Black people and the Latinos. Like, this is a kind of common ground, because ultimately we are all workers and we have the realities of the dynamics. So we can focus on being in our silo and looking suspiciously at the people who are over here. But ultimately we are all going to have the same substandard wages, the same unsafe working conditions, the same sorts of exploitation. And the question is whether we want to do that alone or we want to get together and fight to have something better. And so I think that when we look at COVID doesn't care. You know, we're looking at the communities that have double the infection rate in New York, where I live. That's Black people and that's brown people. We look at people who have double and triple the death rate. That is Black and brown folk. And when I was out, you know, when the lockdown first happened in New York, which is very eerie, it's a very eerie place for it to be empty, I would sometimes go out late at night and ride my bike. Like, that was like a kind of sanity. You know, I had to get out for, like, just to see like what was going on in the world. And the streets would be completely empty, except for two things: ambulances and bike delivery people, you know, food delivery people. And when I looked up and I would look around and see who was on the bike, riding around to these dangerous places, knocking on the door to bring someone their food, and then going out into an elevator that somebody might have just coughed in, or touching a doorknob that someone might have you know, put a pathogen on inadvertently, like all those kinds of things. They were Africans, they were Latinos. It was like, what you have in common is that bike and this disease and the disregard of the society that doesn't recognize how important your contributions are. So I think that to the extent that we get on the same page about that, about those dynamics, I think that the possibilities of alliances in these communities become that much better.
Wow. Thank you so much for this. Precious, I know you were going to close us out with a great question that just came in from Carol. Do you want to read it?
Yes, and Carol, thank you so much for this. So what do each of you have to share regarding the day after, if you will, when we finally get the result? Regarding our post-election stance, whether Trump or like minds wins or loses the election, there will be a distrust of outcomes because that's the current culture. What is actually going to possibly bring people together after that?
When you said bringing people together, I don't think that there's some things I'm not going to reconcile, but I think we should get away from the idea that the day after the election is going to bring any kind of closure or clarity about what's happening politically in this country. In all likelihood, it won't. The lawyers are gearing up now. I know we interview these people. There are, at this point, like almost 300 lawsuits that are flying back and forth between Democrats and Republicans in various states. And so they are trying to preemptively get lawsuits going that are going to impact the way that the election is carried out. And there will be more, another flurry of them that come right after. So, look at Wisconsin, look at Pennsylvania, certainly look at Ohio, look at Arizona. Every place that has a chance of being close, there's going to be a bunch of lawsuits there. And so we'll be kind of wading through that. And the other thing I think is that in terms of what brings people together, that is a much bigger project. The work of democracy is not ending. And the attempts to cement a coalition that can win the presidency and the attempts to cement a coalition that can sustain a country are both titanic undertakings. So I think we should just be very clear that we have a great deal of work ahead of us, no matter what the results ultimately are.
Thank you. I think this is the point to bring us back to our premise, voting as a spiritual practice. Because if there is anything that is our responsibility, it's the moments after. Whenever, whether it's President Pelosi who brings in the election results, because that's the default if we can't decide, whoever brings in this moment, this is our opportunity as people of faith. We are going to have to pitch a bigger tent. We're going to have to get out of our silos, out of our progressive cannibalism, where we attack anybody who doesn't agree with our narrow definition of what justice and equality looks like. I heard someone say, if we create a world that works for transgender, low income, women with disabilities, right? People of color, women of color with disabilities, if we create that world, a world that works for them, then all the rest of us will be free. And so that's the thing that we have to do. We have to stop in our spiritual communities leaving people out. This is why I talk about loving Donald Trump, not because I think that that's going to solve everything, but because there is no other solution that doesn't involve seeing all of us as part of the whole. I think the other thing, I was on a panel for 1 year after Charlottesville. And there was a bunch of journalists there, and they were talking about, well, what can we do differently? I was like, we have to tell different stories. This is our job as people of faith, as communities. We have to tell the stories of transformation. So some of you may know that there was a Muslim woman in Charlottesville who was making a documentary on white supremacists. And there was a man there, I've told this story at church a bunch of times, who was a grand wizard in the Ku Klux Klan in Florida, who was the subject of her documentary. He had heat stroke, and she helped him when he had heat stroke. He went back home and started to think about his position, think about her, and why did she give him that glass of water? Why did she help him? And he went out and met his Black neighbor who was a minister. And 1 year after Charlottesville, he was baptized by this Black minister in a creek in Florida to join a Black church. We're not telling that story. That's the story we have to start telling. We have to start talking about the power of faith, the power of a glass of water. Now, I'm not saying we got to kumbaya and everybody's got to take water to the Klan. Don't quote me as having said that. I'm saying if we really are about the business of being people of faith, we need to be thinking about that day after the election results come in right now and living like we are the ones that have the oxygen, that have the vision for a one united, not just country, but world, one united people. What does that actually look like? Have we spent time thinking about what that looks like and devoting ourselves to that goal? Because all of this fits into all of that.
Thank you both. This was simply outstanding. And thank you, Carol, for that question. That was the perfect way for us to close. There is a lot of conversation going on in the chat right now. Liza, thank you for the link to the East Point Peace Academy, which is led by Kazu Haga.
Yes, Kazu is amazing. One of the people that worked with me on the Oscar Grant movement and brought that nonviolent consciousness. So yes, please support Kazu and Reverend Liza, because her work is also amazing.
Yeah. So please, everyone, make sure you check out the chat for those links. The Peace Academy is holding a series of Zoom trainings to prepare for nonviolent action in the wake of the election. So that is the work for us to do right there. We can get started. So on behalf of East Bay Church of Religious Science, I can't say enough. Thank you so much, Dereca and Jelani. You all, this was like amazing, you know? I mean, we know we don't have to worry because you all are truly gifted and God is in this conversation and is here right now. And so we just really appreciate everything, the richness that you brought today. And yeah, we have a lot of work to do and a lot to think about. So thank you all very much. We're gonna close though with our a couple of words from our board president, Arlene King. Just again, this was awesome. And
thank you, Precious. Thank you so
yeah,
much for bringing us together. And thank you, Dr. Cobb. It's just been just a dream to talk with you in this way. I'm looking forward to our playlist. And of course, thank you to my East Bay family and all the people who came and commented and asked really good, hard questions. And I just agree with you, Precious. We don't have to worry, but we do have to work.
yes.
Thank you all for having us.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. And I will echo your request that we get a playlist, you know, for this.
Yes, please put your playlist selections in the chat. We can distribute that to everybody. A couple of things before Arlene comes on. For all of you who attended, we do have a post-event survey that will be emailed out to you. If you all would be so kind as to complete that, that will help us with our work. I believe, I know that everyone found this time together to be incredibly valuable, and we want to have more programming like this. Someone has their hand raised. Unfortunately, if you could post something in the chat or the Q&A, because we're not able to turn the sound on for the audience. And those are my housekeeping items. Arlene, why don't you close us out?
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, everybody. Dr. Cobb, Reverend Dereca, yeah. Thank you so much for being here. I am super excited and I am just amazed at what I learned today. So if I learned, I'm sure we all did. So we take these lessons back out into the world. We have a few days before we vote, and I think we have got some good feedback on how to move forward with our thinking and voting. So let's take that within and apply what we learned today. I just want to give everyone an update for those who are new to East Bay, how to connect with us. You heard a lot about connection tonight, and we're the place that offers connection. We meet Sundays for our service. Sometimes you'll hear Reverend Dereca there and others. So you're welcome to join us Sundays at 10:15. You can reach us through Facebook Live, YouTube. And to learn more about our ministry, what we do, you can visit us on our website, which is there, ebcrs.org. The transformation is the word I take away tonight. And that's what we're about, transforming the planet that was mentioned earlier when we came on the call. So one of the things we're doing with our Sacred Activism ministry, which we started about maybe a month and a half ago, we've been teaching our community members about the initiatives in their area. So we've done Oakland, Berkeley, and one other one I can't remember, Richmond. We've met with our members in those communities and talked about the initiatives in their area. And Peggy Moore has done an amazing job of educating folks and giving them more tools to work with before they go to the ballot. Tonight, we are meeting with the city of Pittsburgh. On Saturday, we have our California propositions that will be reviewed. This will be important to everybody who lives in California, so we invite you to join. Next Tuesday, city of Hayward, and then Antioch on next Thursday. So this has been well received, and we invite all to join. All the information can be found on our website as well, how to connect with us through Zoom, and we look forward to having those folks join. The next big thing and final thing I want to call out is our 10th annual prayer symposium. This is a weekend that started 10 years ago for a time for reflection, renewal, and just coming together in community. That's happening the last week, second to last week in October. We're having our kickoff on Friday, October 23rd with East Bay in the House virtual dance party hosted by one of our local DJs and bands. So a good time to get on Zoom and just have a great time. Then Saturday, we have our conference, which will go from 9 to 3. And I don't know why September is there, but it's happening in October. That's a full day of workshop, guest speakers, music, and connection. And Don Miguel Rios Jr. is one of our keynote speakers, as well as our local young adult Lucian Baker will be there as well, along with East Bay's music workshop, and just a good day to come out and just take care of yourself. And that's what it's all about. So we look forward to seeing folks there. Again, you can find more about that on our website. And again, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you is not enough, but we appreciate this. Again, we put our footprint on something new and exciting for East Bay. And again, Dr. Cobb, Reverend Dereca, thank you so much. And thanks everyone who joined.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Take care.
Back to you, Precious.
You know, I'm one of those people talking while she's muted. But anyway, thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening. We did have this live streaming to YouTube, so it will be available. So please share this far and wide. There are jewels of information for so many. Have a good evening. Thank you all.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.